Namaskar, and thank you for being with us here once again on the Economic Brief, the program that looks at key stories from the worlds of business, finance and economy and puts them into an Indian as well as a global context. Now on the show, S&P Global sees emerging markets contributing about 65% of global economic growth by 2035. We'll look at that in the context also of the recent BRICS summit. China's stimulus of around 1 trillion yuan is not doing enough to lift that economy out of a slowdown. It's not boosting key sectors like real estate. Bangladesh's apparel exports in 2023 reached a staggering $47.5 billion, over 86% of its total export earnings. Now, how has the crisis hit this once thriving industry? We'll take a look. Also, widespread blackouts triggered by fuel shortages and infrastructure issues have hit Cuba's population hard. But first, let's listen to what India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman had to say about pressures being put on borrowers by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Now, she is in the United States for the annual meetings of these Bretton Woods institutions, and she spoke of the need for a more, understanding approach on loans with strict conditions.
Much before the IMFs of the world reached some countries in our neighborhood. And I'm not saying this with a sense of boast. I'm saying it more with a sense of responsibility. And again, sorry, I have no axe to grind with the IMF, but with no conditions attached. We have given sums of money, which I don't want to name here, number here, because my neighbors are very dear to me. Right. We've come out in time to help countries in distress.
Well, an S&P Global report called the Decisive Decade is seeing the next 10 years as driven by the emerging markets. India and China are listed as among these emerging markets, and hence we can see that the sphere of influence is obviously large. But the conclusion that 65% of economic growth by 2035 will come from the emerging markets says that definitely the global south is on its way up the ladder. S&P Global's report on emerging markets, titled A Decisive Decade, highlights that emerging markets are expected to play a crucial role in global economic growth over the next decade. By 2035, these markets are projected to contribute about 65% of global economic growth. But overall, the world economy is facing tough times for the medium term.
Performance in emerging Asia remains robust, despite a slight downward revision for China to 4.8% in 2024.
This growth is driven by supportive demographics, abundant natural resources, evolving trade dynamics, and technological innovations in energy and manufacturing. China and India are included in emerging markets, and hence it becomes clear why emerging markets are expected to average 4.06% GDP growth through 2035 compared to just 1.59% for advanced economies. India has opened a gateway to an inclusive global growth agenda. It is clear that groupings like BRICS and G20 are now presenting the world with a far more inclusive economic agenda, something that countries of the global south are looking to capitalize on.
With BRICS, we would share interest in economics and trade opportunities, including digital economy, alternative energy, and of course, in assisting one another to promote in the sustainability development.
But what's going for India? Expanding domestic markets, reconfigured supply chains, and increased trade and investment. The World Bank has projected a robust 7% GDP growth rate for India in FY 2024-25, with similarly positive forecasts for the future. The IMF too has plotted India's rapid rise to the world's fifth largest economy.
It is an aspiration for all Indians to want to see India developed by a certain milestone, and keeping 2047, that is 100 years after we obtained independence from imperial rule. It's not too ambitious to say by that time let us work to have an India which is built with our sweat and toil.
The Make in India has been pivotal in positioning India as a global manufacturing hub. attracting large amounts of FDI that has fueled industrial growth, created jobs and strengthened India's role in global supply chains. The recent Hyundai India IPO is a case in point.
This IPO is the right action for us to take a step forward to further Indianize our operations, and we want to become a home brand for the trust brand in India.
Niti Aayog has reported how 250 million Indians escaped multi-dimensional poverty in the last decade. India's reforms have led the way. GST in 2017 has led to robust monthly tax collections. Financial inclusion and UPI payment gateways have brought millions previously unbanked into the formal financial fold, exposing them to wider market dynamics. That's the kind of digital foundation that the Global South wishes to emulate. The Economic Brief, DD India. Well, joining us in the studio is Sriram Srirangam. He is an author and economist who is an expert on the Indian economy. And we are joined also on Zoom by Dr. Amit Kapoor, who is a well-known, eminent economist. Thank you very much both for being with us. Dr. Kapoor, let me start with you. Do you see BRICS emerging as a strong economic bloc, given the growing interest in emerging economies?
So I think it's a fairly easy question to answer. The definite answer is that yes, BRICS is going to be one of the most important set of countries which is going to be driving economic growth. If you really look at the rate of growth that we are expecting within the BRIC economy, that's going to be anything between 4% to 8%, depending on the country that we are talking about. If you talk about India, India is definitely going to grow at least 7%. I suspect that India will grow at a 9%, 10% over a period of time, once our basic infrastructure and everything is really taken care of. And as this economic growth is going to happen, what we would see is that the contribution of these countries is going to be substantial within the growth perspective. So if you really look at the numbers that are being projected, which I totally agree with, that 65% of the global economy GDP is going to come from the emerging economies, which are the top 20 countries of the world. And out of that, India right now is just close to about 3.5% of the global GDP. It is going to substantially enhance. And in terms of the momentum that the world is seeing, even today, if you really look at that number, India is the largest momentum providing country in the world today in terms of economic growth, because India is one of those spots, or the bright spots, which is driving this.
Mr. Srirangam, how important is India's approach of voicing the concerns of the Global South, for greater economic linkages between the developing countries?
That's very important. If you see the linkages we have with the countries of the South, you call them South or developing countries or call them emerging markets in a certain economic sense. Yes, it's very important that we keep these alliances, be it BRICS or there's another little-known body called IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, and then G20 is there. Half of them are South countries, emerging markets. And then you've got BIMSTEC and so on and so forth. This is crucial for getting investment, trade flows, connectivity, and propelling growth of all the member countries. So being a leader of the Global South, which we have demonstrated by lobbying successfully for the inclusion of G20 in the G20 of the African Union last September, yes, it's very important for economic growth and also as a historic statement that we're all together, solidarity to take the history forward.
Dr. Kapoor, do you see India's, external economic relations also capitalizing on the current window of opportunity, if one can see it that way? Because there seems to be, a chance here for India to really, have some advantage.
Definitely. If you really look at the recent 5 years or the past 5 years, how India has really moved forward, that we are clearly seeing that India is becoming more embedded with the global value chains. We are seeing that India is emerging as an alternate supplier for many products over a period of time. If you really talk about the semiconductor industry, India has really started putting in a lot of effort. And we are also seeing the results. If you talk about electronics per se, India is seeing a lot of positive uptick at this point in time. This also has a huge benefit in terms of, say, job creation, etc. But having said that, there are going to be other set of industries where India is going to have a huge impact over a period of time. In fact, as India opens up more, as India gets into that international trade more across countries, we are going to be seeing some substantive tick up in terms of how exports happen. Right now, if you really look at the numbers, like India does contribute hugely to exports per se, like 22, 23% of our GDP is being driven by exports. It is going to become much more substantial over a period of time. And this substantial thing is going to happen more because of the integration within the global supply chains, where, as you were talking about in the program or the earlier program, Hyundai. It's a great success story in terms of like how Hyundai is looking at India as one of the most important supplying nations over a period of time, because the IPO is just not about success within the country, it is also about success outside the country, how you're able to export your products.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Srirangam, would you consider the concerns that China is facing going to be a sort of a roadblock for the global South? I mean, China is also clubbed with the emerging economies.
Yes, but the roadblock of making about 4.8% this year, 4.2.5 something next year, that by global standards is not a roadblock. By Chinese standards, yes, it is a great slowdown. China is up to it. It's got some stimulus going, monetary, fiscal, administrative, and for China maybe out of woods maybe in a couple of years, because time and again we have seen resilience on the part of China. This crisis may be a poly crisis, but still I'm hopeful that China will not drag the South down.
Okay. In fact, moving on to our next story, which is about China's stimulus. At the outset, let's try to understand why a heavily export-oriented economy like China has certain limitations. First, there's the dependency on global markets. So the issue of trade imbalances could lead to tensions with trading partners and potential retaliatory measures. That's happening already between China and many countries, including the US. But, overproduction also has environmental costs. But apart from that, what do you do with all the excess production that China produces? So is dumping the solution? Now then, there are also possibly poor working conditions, low wages, labor disputes that could arise. Also a complete neglect of the domestic market. That's not all, because the economy will become exchange rate hypersensitive or oversensitive to supply disruptions as well as exchange rate fluctuations.
I've been arguing that China is at the fork on the road. If they continue with their current model, which is export-led growth, there will be trouble. Why? Because the Chinese economy has grown to a point when China's export is no more a minor factor in global trade.
Well, in late September 2024, the Chinese authorities, they announced measures to stimulate the economic activity there, to support the property market and to boost consumer confidence. There was a monetary stimulus of about 1 trillion yuan, that's approximately $141.82 billion. There were interest rate cuts that came down from 1.7% to 1.5%. This is to guide the prime lending rate. And also mortgage rate cuts by around 0.5 percentage points. And that is to benefit approximately 50 million households. Special bonds also worth about 2 trillion yuan, or about $284.43 billion. And this was specifically for local governments to tackle their debt problems and also to subsidize goods so that they can boost demands for homes, for household goods, so that people, can improve the standard of living in homes, and then over time that would increase the demand for homes. However, now the IMF believes that these measures are insufficient in themselves to lift China's growth in a material way.
And that's weaker second quarter of the year is reflecting continued decline in confidence in the household and corporate sector, and also the continued problems in the property sector in China.
Well, Mr. Srirangam and Dr. Kapoor are still with us. Dr. Kapoor, is China's stimulus going to boost the domestic demand in that country?
I think not really, because what China has done is fairly too little at this point in time. Like, yes, they have a close to about $140, $150 billion stimulus that has gone, but that is not really going to drive a lot of things, because like the larger problem in China is going to be how do they raise or continue to raise the per capita incomes across for their population. Right now, their per capita income is close to about $12,500 USD. Now, the larger question is going to be that will their consumption-led economic system, can it actually continue to fire on all cylinders? Now, what we are seeing in China is possibly a middle-income trap that they're really getting into. And to really get out of that, the question is going to be that how do they improve their levels of productivity further? Because when you talk about the issue of China in terms of like the export-led model, what has happened is they have clearly neglected certain parts or certain regions of China. Because if you really look at China and if you just break it into half versus left and the right, you would see that 94% of the population lives on the right, but most of the economic benefit is happening from the extreme right of China in terms of like the towns or the provinces on the port area or near the sea. So the economic benefits have not trickled down to the other regions in China. So the question here is going to be that how the stimulus is going to help create growth in the other set of provinces in China, not just Shenzhen or Shanghai or Beijing. It has to really go beyond that. And when you talk about the stimulus is going to just help some bits within the property market, which is already oversupplied. And how do we really create that stimulus per se? Because there are groups like Evergrande, which, if I get my numbers right, they're close to about $300 billion in debt. Yes. So their enterprises are also severely under debt right now. And if that system collapses, or if Evergrande collapses, you're talking about a collapse of a nature which is going to be very similar to the 2008 crisis that US did see. And it trickled down to the world. I don't suspect that China's issue is going to trickle down in the world, but there would be a certain level of shrillness that will happen. So there would be a certain kind of hiccups across the world. But yes, this is not really going to help much. They have to do far better, far deeper in terms of upticking their consumption cycle once again.
Mr. Srirangam, how do the market forces operate in China? Would you say that there's too much state control and that is probably a problem?
China is not a market economy by WTO definition. It has a lot of opaqueness. There is too much of subsidy. Nothing is known about who gets what, how, when, and all that. That's one big problem. Another problem is, yes, the ideological stranglehold on the economy is telling in terms of falling private sector investment. Jack Ma is hiding in Japan. So the ideology, the Communist Party, control, private sector, not investing, this is one side of the story. The other side is, lack of transparency, as we were talking about. That leaves the Chinese economy, a lot of people suspect it. After all, why is there a backlash against Chinese exports, the so-called overcapacity, etc.? Consumption, yes, is there. Deceleration of the economy is also there. But there is also this problem of Chinese subsidization and dumping. That is why the world is not liking Chinese goods anymore. So yes, China by any standards is not a market economy.
Indeed. Dr. Kapoor, coming back to that issue on the real estate front, according to media reports, China has around 60 million unsold apartments. And it's going to take like several years for these to be sold. How long do you think it's going to build buyers' confidence, in fact, to return? They probably are not willing to buy at the current time.
Well, so I think, one, I disagree with your statement when you say it is going to take a couple of years to get sold. It is going to take a decade or so to get sold. So that's where it is going to be. It's not happening anytime soon. But if you really look at this whole thing in terms of mortgage rates that are happening in China, there is a certain small short-term correction that we might see, but the oversupply of unsold homes and the financial instability of the developers, as we are seeing, is going to have a very telling role. There is also another thing that we are not talking about, and that is the demographic challenge that China has as of now. Its aging population, slower rates of urbanization, activity not really going to various other locations beyond the certain set of port regions. So there might be some prevention in the short run, but they will have to really set things right for the long term, wherein they are able to spread the growth. In fact, they're essentially trying to apply old solution to the new problems that they're facing, because their one-child policy has come to bite over a period of time, which hardly very few people talk about, but it is going to be one of their biggest challenges, because When you really talk about China accepting a slower but more sustainable growth while implementing deeper reforms is going to be a story to see. But I hope they do that, because sustainability, solid, what I call creating resilience, is going to be the key for that.
Final word from you, Mr. Srirangam. You know, China has been using checkbook diplomacy, has a lot of surplus funds, their Belt and Road Initiative. All this going to take a bit of a beating because of what's happening there?
Yes, there is already, as we talked about in the backlash, the BRI is not working. There is protest in Pakistan. You have seen Maldives trying to rebalance. Initially, they went one way for China. Sri Lanka is rebalancing, and Africa is also up against China. So this geoeconomics of BRI and trying to export it to them because they can't export anywhere else, that's not going to work. And so, yes, China, it's a new China now. They can't be any more overconfident. The present is ours, the future is ours, our politics, our economics. No, that era is gone. China has to reinvent itself to be friendly. The geopolitics of West Asia means a lot of loss for China. And the Ukraine war also could mean quite a bit of a shock for China. And so it's not going to be easy for China for the first time now.
We leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Srirangam, for joining us here in the studio, and Dr. Amit Kapoor for your inputs. Thanks both of you for enlightening us on this subject. Now moving on to our next story, which is about Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, in fact, the garment industry, which accounts for most of the exports, has suffered a loss of $400 million in just 2 months, highlighting the country's deep economic issues. This report gets us more.
The Bangladeshi economy remains in shambles as unrest following the fall of the Sheikh Hasina government continues. The biggest casualty is the country's crucial garment industry. According to Bangladesh Garments and Industrial Workers Federation, the industry has lost $400 million in just 2 months. The South Asian nation's 3,500 textile factories account for around 85% of its $55 billion in annual exports. Bangladesh is also the world's second biggest exporter of clothing by value after China. It caters to many global brands like Zara and H&M. In recent days, several factories around the capital Dhaka were shut as workers protested, demanding better pay. As the demonstrations continued, the chief advisor of the interim government, Mohammad Yunus, warned that he won't tolerate disruption in garment exports. Fixing the country's ailing economy has been the key challenge before Economics Nobel laureate Yunus. Under him, Bangladesh has sought $5 billion in financial aid from global leaders. Meanwhile, government industry is not the only one struggling. Common people are also finding it difficult to cope with the rising inflation.
I'm struggling on every step to meet the needs of my family despite working 2 jobs at a time. As you can see, my shop does not have many goods for sale because I cannot afford to stock up the racks due to inflation.
Authorities have blamed stockpilers syndicates, saying that they are creating an artificial crisis in the market.
Any syndicate would be broken by us. Then only analyzing the market situation, we can detect them, we can locate their position, their status, and we will intervene there. If necessary, we will use our legal instruments.
The economic woes have been worsened by protests demanding President Mohammad Shahabuddin's resignation, which have highlighted Bangladesh's political instability. The Economic Brief, DD India.
Well, Cuba's capital, Havana, is facing an ongoing power outage. I mean, there are a lot of our power outages that have disrupted daily life across the island. Now, on the 17th of October, widespread blackouts were triggered by fuel shortages and infrastructure issues, leading to the closure of schools as well as non-essential businesses. Residents took to the streets to protest this crisis, which has significantly impacted the tourism sector. We conclude with this report from Dipanshu Kashyap. Thanks very much for watching. Namaskar.
The National Electric Union, Cuba's state-run power company, has acknowledged its inability to meet the nation's electricity demands due to fuel shortages and infrastructure failures. The shortfall has left millions of Cubans without power, affecting over half the island. The Energy Ministry reported that a failure at one of Cuba's major power plants caused the national electrical grid to shut down. While demand surged to 3,300 megawatts, the supply was a mere 1,692 megawatts.
We are reviewing the reasons for the shutdown. We currently do not have the cause, but when the unit went offline, the system collapsed.
In response to the crisis, the government has shut down schools and non-essential industries, sending workers home to conserve energy and reduce blackouts that have exceeded 12 hours a day. In the capital Havana, frustrated Cubans took to the streets banging pots and chanting "Turn on the lights." Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel accused the protesters of attempting to disrupt public order.
The only thing that contrasts with our people's determination to unite and overcome adversity is a small group, mostly intoxicated, behaving indecently. They have tried to create public disorder and disturb the civic peace.
Authorities claim that the power has been restored to most parts of the capital. However, the blackouts have severely impacted Havana's tourism industry, leading to food spoilage and prompting some travelers to cancel their trips.
We need power to come back because we are at a point of desperation. As a tourism worker, I'm struggling. Food is rotting, drinks are warm, and we can barely provide service. We are just trying to survive. Let's hope this gets resolved.
The island-wide blackout is a result of factors like a fragile power generation network reliant almost entirely on fossil fuels, difficulties in purchasing fuel exacerbated by the tightened US embargo, economic impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic leading to a decline in tourism revenue, and long-standing economic mismanagement resulting in severe inflation and shortages of essential goods. While electricity supply has been restored in Havana, much of the island remains without power, raising doubts about the government's ability to effectively address the energy crisis. Diptanshu Kashyap's report for the Economic Brief, DD India.